They told everyone I was invisible. They never expected to see my face on a screen, 10 stories tall, smiling back at them. They thought my silence meant surrender, that my absence was proof I had nothing left to give. It wasn't failure. It was something waiting for the right moment, a seed buried deeper than they could imagine. Some nights, I would close my eyes and wonder if they'd ever know who I was becoming, if they'd ever see the person behind the quiet. But I stopped wishing for their permission, because even before the campaign, even before the billboards, I already knew. I was never a nobody. I was just out of sight. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. When I was growing up in Portland, everyone assumed I would be someone important. Not important in the way that matters to you when you're young, like making people feel seen or heard, but in the glossy way that makes relatives brag over Thanksgiving dinner. My mother, Karen Mitchell, used to call me her future attorney. She'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, pressing the eraser end of her pencil to the rim of her coffee mug, and say, "I can already see you with a case file under your arm. You'll walk right into the courtroom and make everyone listen." I thought I wanted that, too. At 17, I told everyone I was going to Georgetown for pre-law. My father, Robert, nodded like that was the only answer that made sense. My older brother, Jason, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Finally, someone in this family will do something real." Even then, I felt like my life was a script somebody else had written, and I was trying to remember my lines. By 19, I was already tired. Not the kind of tired that goes away with a nap or a weekend off, but the kind that settles into your bones, like the body you're in isn't quite the right fit. I stayed up late in the dorm library, reading case studies until my eyes blurred. I told myself this was just what success required: sacrifice, exhaustion, obedience. I remember one night, around 2 a.m, staring at a sentence I'd read 6 times. I thought, I'm not alive in this story. I'm a placeholder. But I didn't say it out loud. By the time I graduated, the burnout was so complete it felt like I'd scorched away whatever curiosity I'd started with. I didn't go straight to law school. Instead, I took a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in downtown Portland, doing copywriting and client presentations. It wasn't what anyone expected of me, but I thought maybe if I stepped away for a year, I'd remember who I was trying to become. That year became 3. And every Christmas, every birthday dinner, every phone call, I heard the same question. When are you going to get serious again? When are you going back to law? We just don't want you to waste your potential. I wish I could say it was easy to ignore. But every time they asked, it felt like a pinprick in the softest part of me. Like they were confirming what I suspected, that whatever I was doing, it didn't count. That I didn't count. By my late 20s, the marketing job started to feel like another version of the same trap. I was writing lines to sell things I didn't care about to people I'd never meet. It wasn't awful exactly, it just felt hollow. There was one afternoon that finally cracked something in me open. I was presenting a proposal to a client, a large software company that wanted a rebrand to feel more authentic. I spent 2 weeks crafting the language, making sure every sentence felt clean and true. The client scrolled through the slides on my laptop, expression blank. When I finished, he looked up and said, "Honestly, nobody's going to remember this. Just make it shinier." I nodded because that's what you do in those rooms. But when I got back to my desk, I realized my hands were shaking. That night, I went home and stood in my kitchen with the lights off, feeling like the last 10 years had dissolved under fluorescent bulbs and polite applause. My brother called a few days later. He asked how work was going. I told him the truth, that I felt like I was disappearing in plain sight. He didn't pause. "Well, you could always go back to law school," he said. Like that was the only measure of worth he could imagine. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the floor and let the silence stretch between us. After we hung up, I sat alone on my couch and made a decision. I wasn't going to keep living a story that made me feel small. Even if I didn't know what came next, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was enough. I quit my job the next week. When I told my parents, my mother pressed her lips together like she was trying not to say something she'd regret. My father just looked tired. "She's just taking a break," my mom said later on the phone to my aunt. "We don't talk about that anymore. My dad murmured when the subject came up at family dinners. They called it a phase. They called it indulgent. They called it everything but brave. I thought maybe, if I found something that felt true, they'd understand. Maybe they'd see me again. But the truth is, I started over, and no one noticed. The first morning after I quit my job, I woke up without an alarm. I lay in bed for nearly an hour, listening to the sounds outside my window, the delivery trucks groaning past, the neighbor's dog barking, the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for me to show up. At first, that felt liberating. Then it felt terrifying. I tried to fill the days with something that looked productive. I made lists of potential contract clients, browsed job boards, scribbled half-finished business ideas in a spiral notebook. But every time I imagined going back to the corporate world, my chest tightened. 3 weeks in, I was sitting in a coffee shop on Hawthorne Boulevard when I noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board by the bathroom door. It was printed on plain white paper, a little crooked, with tear-off phone numbers hanging limply from the bottom. Community tech volunteers needed, it read. Teach digital skills to seniors in East Portland. It didn't sound glamorous. It didn't sound important. But something about the simplicity of it caught me off guard. I tore off a tab and called the number that afternoon. A woman named Denise picked up. She sounded exhausted but kind. She explained that they were short-staffed and underfunded, but they were determined to keep the program alive. I agreed to come in for training the next week. The community center was a faded brick building tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store. Inside, the carpet was threadbare, and the computers were at least a decade old. But when Denise showed me around, her voice had the quiet conviction of someone who believed every small gesture mattered. "We don't expect miracles," she said, leading me past a row of computers with sticky notes labeling each station. "Just patience and a little empathy." I thought, maybe I can do that. My first day, I was paired with a woman named Helen. She must have been in her 70s, her hair pinned back in a careful bun, her cardigan buttoned all the way to her throat. She barely looked at me as I sat beside her. "This machine hates me," she muttered, tapping one gnarled finger against the keyboard. I smiled, trying to reassure her. "Maybe it's just waiting for you to give it a chance." She shot me a look over her glasses, as if to say she'd heard that before. We started with the basics: how to open a browser, how to check email, how to enlarge the text on the screen so she didn't have to squint. Every few minutes, she sighed in frustration. But she didn't leave. After about an hour, I helped her log into her Facebook account. Her hands trembled on the mouse as she clicked through the notifications. Then she froze, staring at a message. "What is it?" I asked softly. She swallowed, her voice rough when she answered. "My grandson. He sent me a video of his graduation." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "I haven't seen him in years," she whispered. I didn't know he thought of me." I sat with her while she watched the video all the way through. She didn't say much after that, but when she stood up to leave, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "You brought my baby into my living room." That night, I lay awake replaying the moment in my head. It felt small, almost inconsequential compared to the polished projects I used to pitch in boardrooms. But in that quiet, I realized something had shifted. It didn't make headlines, but it mattered. Over the next few months, I started showing up to the center every week. Sometimes twice a week if Denise called in a panic because no one else could come. I got to know the regulars: Helen, who eventually learned how to order her groceries online; Stan, who sent long rambling emails to his sister in Montana; and Gloria, who spent entire afternoons scrolling through old photographs. Each session was filled with tiny victories. An email sent, a photo saved, a video call answered. It wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't even the life I thought I wanted. But when I left the center each day, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that didn't depend on someone else's approval. Sometimes, my family asked what I was doing with all my free time. I told them I was volunteering, helping people learn the basics of technology. My brother's voice on the phone was always edged with something between amusement and disbelief. Teaching old folks to click buttons? Real noble work, he'd say, his tone dripping with irony. I didn't argue anymore, because while he was measuring worth in titles and salaries, I was watching faces light up when the screen finally did what it was supposed to. I started to understand that the size of a stage doesn't determine the value of the performance. I was building something, even if no one else could see it yet. By the start of the next year, the small volunteer program at the community center had turned into something much bigger than any of us had planned. It started with word of mouth. One of Helen's friends, a retired librarian named Marjorie, came in for help setting up a tablet her daughter had sent her for Christmas. After Marjorie told her church group how patient the young lady at the center was, a steady trickle of new faces began showing up every week. Denise called me one afternoon, her voice taut with a strange mix of panic and exhilaration. "Lauren," she said, "I just had 15 people register in the past 2 days. We don't have enough staff. Would you ever consider helping me make this official?" I hesitated. Official sounded like more than volunteering. It sounded like a commitment. But when I pictured those faces, the tentative smiles when someone finally mastered a simple task, I felt something settle in my chest, something that felt like certainty. "Yes," I told her. "Let's do it." Over the next 6 months, we cobbled together a program we named Digital Bridges. We wrote a mission statement, set up a website with a clunky donation button, and applied for small grants wherever we could find them. I learned how to do things I never expected: writing proposals to city organizations, coordinating volunteers, negotiating with local businesses for donated equipment. The first time a grant application was approved, Denise and I sat in the empty computer lab, staring at the email in disbelief. "They actually picked us," she whispered. I nodded, tears prickling behind my eyes. "That means we're not just making this up anymore," I said. Within a year, Digital Bridges had grown into something that reached far beyond that single community center. We started hosting workshops in libraries, churches, and senior apartment complexes across East Portland. We tracked our impact meticulously because funders always wanted numbers. "We've onboarded 1,200 seniors in the last 9 months, I told the city council liaison during a funding review. "We have a 78% email open rate for our weekly tech tips. That's higher than some Fortune 500 companies." He raised his eyebrows. "That's impressive," he admitted. But outside those conversations, no one seemed particularly impressed. I'd go to dinner with my parents, and after the obligatory updates from my brother's real estate business, someone would ask how my little project was going. My mother would smile politely, tilting her head the way she did when she was trying to be supportive but couldn't quite understand. "That's nice," she'd say. "So, you're still doing that computer thing?" I'd nod. "Teaching old folks to click buttons?" "Real noble work," Jason would chime in, just like always. Sometimes I'd catch my father's eyes across the table, warm but distant, as though he was looking at a stranger he'd heard about in passing. In those moments, I'd feel a flicker of old shame, a whisper of that voice that said, if it doesn't look like success to them, maybe it isn't real. But then I'd remember the notes I kept in a shoebox in my closet, the thank you cards in shaky handwriting, the printed photos of smiling seniors holding up certificates of completion. Marjorie's note was one of my favorites. "Dear Lauren, before I met you, I thought the world had moved on without me. Thank you for bringing me along." Whenever doubt crept in, I'd pull that shoebox down from the shelf and read a few of the letters. I'd remember that impact isn't always measured by headlines or LinkedIn updates. Sometimes it's measured by a single life feeling less alone. As Digital Bridges expanded, Denise and I started getting invitations to local conferences. We'd speak about closing the digital divide, about how technology could be a bridge rather than a barrier. I stood on stages with microphones clipped to my collar, addressing rooms full of nonprofit leaders and city officials. It felt surreal, me, the same person who used to wonder if she was disappearing, now offering strategies to help other organizations replicate our model. But at the end of the day, I'd go home, turn the key in my quiet apartment, and know that nothing I said on those stages would ever make my family look at me the way they looked at my brother. One evening, after a particularly long day training volunteers, I stopped by my parents' house. My mother was in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie. I leaned against the doorway, watching her. I ventured, we're going to be featured in the Portland Tribune next month. They're doing a piece about how seniors are using technology to stay connected. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression warm but slightly puzzled. Oh, well, that's nice, she said. Will they pay you for that? I bit the inside of my cheek, willing myself not to bristle.
No, Mom.
It's not about money. It's about raising awareness. She nodded, as if that explained everything and nothing all at once. I just worry, she murmured after a moment, that you're putting so much energy into something that doesn't lead anywhere. I looked at her then, really looked, at the lines around her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together when she was trying to be kind. For a moment, I almost wished I could go back to wanting what she wanted. It would have been simpler, easier. But I couldn't, because I knew that even if they never understood, this was the work that made me feel alive. And sometimes, that had to be enough. I started keeping a small journal on my bedside table, where I recorded every milestone. January, partnered with 3 new libraries. February, launched a pilot program in assisted living facilities. March, passed 2,500 seniors served. Every time I closed that journal, I felt a quiet pride blooming in my chest. Pride that didn't need to be validated by my family's approval. Pride that wasn't loud or showy, but real, and mine alone. The evening that would change everything started out unremarkable. It was late October, and the air carried that damp, wood smoke scent that always made me think of childhood Halloweens. I'd been invited to a small networking event for local nonprofits. Nothing fancy, just a gathering in the back room of a co-working space downtown. I almost didn't go. I was tired, and the idea of making polite conversation felt heavier than usual. But Denise insisted it would be good for visibility, and part of me still believed that maybe, just maybe, the right connection could help us secure more funding. When I arrived, the room was already crowded. Tables draped in white cloths held stacks of business cards and flyers. Someone had strung fairy lights across the ceiling beams, and the glow made everything look softer, more forgiving. I drifted from group to group, smiling, answering the same questions about digital bridges. Most people nodded politely, a few scribbled notes. But it all felt perfunctory, like everyone was just waiting for the real conversations to begin elsewhere. I was about to slip out when I heard someone behind me mention our name. Yeah, it's called Digital Bridges. My brother's fiancée keeps talking about it. She said it helped her grandfather feel human again. The voice belonged to a man in a navy blazer, his hair neatly parted, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He was speaking to a woman holding a glass of white wine, who nodded with polite interest. I turned halfway, pretending to look at the flyers on the nearest table, straining to hear. He went on, his voice growing more animated. She said he was isolated for years. After his wife died, he barely spoke to anyone. But then he started going to these classes, just basic tech stuff, learning to video call, to send emails. Apparently, there was this woman who ran the sessions.
Really patient, she said.
Never talked down to him. My heart began to thump, slow and heavy. The woman with the wine tilted her head. What was her name? He paused, thinking. Lauren something. Mitchell, I think. A flush started at the base of my neck, rising up to my cheeks. He didn't know I was standing 5 feet away. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe evenly. She was just kind, he continued. You wouldn't think something so simple could change a person's life. But it did. He started calling us again. Started telling stories. She made him feel like he still mattered. For a moment, I couldn't move.
Couldn't speak.
I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake, wondering if any of it counted. If any of it would ever ripple beyond those quiet rooms. The woman touched his arm lightly. Sounds like she's doing important work. He smiled.
Yeah.
I think so. Actually, he added, glancing around, I've heard they're going to feature her in that statewide digital inclusion campaign. They're looking for faces, real people, not models. My brother's fiancé nominated her. My breath caught. A campaign. No one had told me. I turned fully then, unable to pretend anymore. My voice came out low, a little shaky. "Excuse me," I said. I couldn't help overhearing. "Did you say Digital Bridges is going to be part of a campaign?" He looked at me, startled.
Yes.
"Are you familiar with it?" I managed a small, careful smile. "I'm Lauren Mitchell." For a second, he just stared. Then his mouth fell open a little, and a flush of embarrassment crept into his cheeks. "Oh, God."
I'm sorry.
I didn't realize he held out his hand, flustered. "I'm David. My brother's fiancée is Emily. I guess you helped her grandfather." I took his hand, feeling the absurd, electric jolt of recognition passing between us. "I'm glad he found it useful," I said quietly. David looked almost relieved to have found me. "You should know she talks about you all the time. She said you changed their family." There was something in his tone, some small note of genuine respect, that loosened a knot I hadn't realized was still there. We stood there for a moment, the din of the room pressing around us, as if everything had been reduced to this one, impossible instant, this stranger who had carried my story farther than I ever could have imagined. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "They're compiling stories for the campaign right now," he said. "I think you should expect a call. They're planning to put faces up on billboards, bus shelters, maybe even TV spots." My mind reeled. Billboards. All those years of feeling unseen, of watching my family look past me. Suddenly it seemed possible that someone might have no choice but to look. Not because I demanded attention, but because the truth had walked in by itself and refused to stay quiet. That night, I went home and sat in my dark living room. The window reflected my face, faint, almost transparent. For so long, I'd wondered if I was making any difference. And here was proof, undeniable, unasked for, unstoppable. I wasn't invisible anymore. The call came 2 weeks later. I was sitting at the folding table in the Digital Bridges office, really just an unused storage closet Denise and I had claimed when my phone rang. A woman with a clear, practiced voice introduced herself as Mia from the Oregon Digital Inclusion Campaign. She explained that they had reviewed dozens of nominations and were building a shortlist of community leaders to feature. "You've been nominated by multiple people," she said, her tone warm. "We'd like to invite you to participate." I gripped the edge of the table, trying to ground myself. "Would you be willing to sit for an interview and a photo session?" Mia continued. "We want to highlight the faces behind the work." I said yes before I could think too hard. When I hung up, Denise looked up from her laptop. "Was that them?" I nodded. Her eyes softened. "I hope you know you deserve this." Part of me still struggled to believe it, but beneath the nervousness, I felt a steady, growing calm. Like I'd finally stepped into a story that belonged to me. A week later, I stood in a small studio on the east side, the bright lights making everything look cleaner and sharper than real life. The photographer, a kind man named Luis, asked me to sit on a simple wooden stool in front of a gray backdrop. "We're going for real," he said. "Nothing posed. Just you." I thought of all the years I'd tried to be someone else, someone impressive, acceptable, easily explained. Then I exhaled and let all of that fall away. When the first photos were posted online, the responses were immediate. Volunteers shared the campaign on Facebook. Former students emailed to say how proud they were. Even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages. One evening, I got a call from my brother, Jason. I stared at his name on the screen, my heart doing that familiar, uneasy flutter. When I picked up, there was a beat of silence before he spoke. "Hey," he said gruffly. "I saw your face on a bus today." I waited, unsure what would come next. "It was cool," he admitted. "I guess I didn't realize how big this had gotten." I almost laughed. "It got big," I said softly, "because it mattered." He cleared his throat.
Yeah.
"Well, congratulations." "I mean it." After he hung up, I sat with my phone resting on my palm. It felt like the first real moment between us in years. A few days later, a small envelope appeared in my mailbox. My mother's handwriting curled across the front. Inside was a card with a photograph of a sunflower on the cover. "We're proud of you," she'd written. even if we don't always understand everything you do. I read the sentence twice, then folded the card closed. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a soft warmth move through me, like a door quietly opening. I tucked the card into my journal. I didn't need it to prove anything. I just wanted to keep it. As the weeks passed, more people stopped me on the street, in the grocery store, even outside the community center. "Are you Lauren? From the campaign?" I always nodded, feeling a gentle astonishment each time. It wasn't pride. It was peace. I had spent so many years thinking success had to look a certain way, that if it wasn't framed in degrees and promotions and carefully worded resumes, it didn't count. But in the quiet hours, long after the billboards came down, I understood that the only validation that ever mattered was the sense that I was finally standing in my own life. One evening, after workshop at the center, I stayed behind to tidy up. I found Helen's old name tag tucked between two keyboards. I turned it over in my hands, remembering that first afternoon when she'd said the machine hated her. I smiled, feeling a softness in my chest. If she could find the courage to learn something new at 70, I could find the courage to keep building something that mattered, no matter who understood it. When I locked up and stepped outside, the sky was turning indigo. The street was quiet. I stood there a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling the simplest, rarest thing of all, contentment. For the first time in my life, I didn't need applause to feel whole. I didn't need a title to feel worthy. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough, because I already knew, and that was more than I had ever hoped for. If you've ever felt unseen, like your story was too small, too quiet to matter, this was for you. Because I spent years believing my worth was measured by how many people were watching, how many nods of approval I could gather, how many trophies I could line up in a glass case I didn't even build. I thought if I didn't meet every expectation, if I didn't follow the safe, scripted path, my life would shrink into something unremarkable. But it didn't. It grew into something wider, softer, truer. It grew into nights spent teaching someone how to open an email so they could see their grandchild's face. Into afternoons in fluorescent-lit rooms where a single smile felt like a whole ceremony of belonging. Into the quiet, invisible moments that no one applauds, but that make you feel like you finally belong to yourself. If you're sitting in a small apartment somewhere, maybe Portland, maybe Pittsburgh, maybe a place so tiny no one has ever heard of it, and you're wondering if what you're building matters, I hope you hear this. It does. It matters more than you know. I used to think I needed permission to start, that I had to wait for some sign, some guarantee that I wouldn't fail, that I wouldn't disappoint everyone who believed they knew what was best for me. But the only permission that counts is the one you give yourself. The permission to try.
To care.
To walk away from stories that feel too tight and too small. I can't promise that choosing your own path will be easy. Mine wasn't. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I should have just gone back to the life everyone expected me to live. There were holidays when I sat at the table and felt like an exhibit, someone they couldn't quite understand but couldn't quite look away from either. But here's what I learned in all those unglamorous hours. Belonging isn't something you earn by meeting other people's standards. It's something you find in the small, everyday choices to stay true to yourself. Sometimes, those choices won't make sense to anyone else. Sometimes, you'll be the only person who sees the value in what you're doing. But I promise, when you wake up one morning and realize you don't need validation anymore, you'll feel a kind of freedom that no title, no paycheck, no applause could ever replicate. If you're watching this and thinking, that's easy for her to say, please believe me when I tell you, it wasn't. I started as a nobody, too. I started as the girl who couldn't look her family in the eye because she felt like a disappointment they were too polite to name. I started as the woman who measured her worth by how many times her phone rang with job offers that never came. I started as the person who almost gave up because invisibility is a heavy thing to carry alone. And if you're carrying it now, I see you. I know what it feels like. I know the quiet ache of wanting to be recognized, not for what you pretend to be, but for who you really are. So, if no one else has told you yet, let me be the first. You are not invisible. You are not too late. You are not too small. You are already enough. And the world is waiting to meet the version of you that doesn't apologize for existing. If you feel brave enough, I'd love to hear your story. Where are you watching from? What quiet victory have you built when no one was watching? Leave a comment, or just whisper it to yourself tonight. Because sometimes saying it out loud is the first step toward believing it's real. Here on this channel, we honor the quiet triumphs, the human stories, the second chances. We celebrate the moments when a single, ordinary person stands up and says, "I'm still here. I'm still trying. And that's enough." Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting my story sit beside yours for a little while. I promise, this is just the beginning. More real stories are coming. More reminders that none of us are as alone as we think. Until next time, keep going. I'll see you soon.